Hello there, and welcome to our last panel of the day. This panel will be on Cyborg Pride and Identity, and the panel's going to be facilitated by Rich McKinnon. And I have to say, I'm very, very pleased that I'm going to hand it over to Rich, who's going to introduce the panel, which I am on. And it's not my problem anymore. But I am very excited to be talking with Rich and Neil about Cyborg Pride. Come on out and let's give everyone a hand.
Hi, welcome to the panel on Cyborg Pride and Identity. And I'm Rich McKinnon, and I'm the founder and executive director of BorgFest, which is a festival for cyborgs. And you all have met Neil before. He did the keynote on Saturday, and he is the founder of the Cyborg Foundation, among many other things. But I'm going to call that particular title out because Cyborg Foundation was established to fight for the rights for cyborgs, which I think is very germane to today's talk. And again, he does way more than that, but that's what is relevant right now. And then Quinn Norton has been our fabulous master of ceremonies the whole weekend. And is this the first panel you're actually serving on?
Yes.
Yes, that's great. All right. So Quinn has a deep background in body hacking, and maybe did you coin the term, or is that credited to you?
I did.
Yeah.
I think it was generated by a few people independently.
Yeah.
But yes, I coined the term in response to the life hacking movement.
Awesome. And you also have an academic background in human identity, which is perfectly suited for today's conversation, right?
Looking forward to it.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's kind of get started on, what is Cyborg Pride, and how does it relate to other kinds of pride that we are familiar with? And I'll start off with you, Quinn. Why don't you kind of chime in on what do you think Cyborg Pride is and how it relates to other kinds of pride?
So the concept of a cyborg is one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and probably use more widely than most people. For me, Cyborg Pride is about having agency over your identity and using technology in a way that assists that agency. Right now, I would say I think the biggest Cyborg Pride issue going in the world is access to birth control, women's access to women's health issues. And a lot of people don't think of that as a cyborgian issue, but it's profoundly cyborgian for me to have control over fertility that nature didn't give me, and I've decided to take. And very few technologies at all have done more to revolutionize the world as women's birth control has done. And we're all kind of trying to live in that post-birth control world now and understand what that means. And sometimes in that, we kind of lose sight. It's become a baseline issue. One of the things I identified very early on in my research is that we think of things as cyborg and out there until a certain point of acceptance when they just become normal. It used to be that dying of childhood illnesses was normal. Now vaccination is kind of considered a human right to most people. Well, that's not normal. That's not nature's baseline. Nature's baseline is you have lots of kids. You have 6 kids in hopes of keeping 3. And I would much rather not live in nature's baseline. I like to say I'm 42 and I have all my teeth, and that's not natural, but I'm going with it. And similarly, having that control over my identity that comes out of getting to say when a human being comes out of my vagina is one of the most fundamental cyborg rights issues there is, or there could be. I think there's a lot more after that. There's a lot more around.
So let's back it up there.
Sorry.
All right. No, it's great because I think Neil and I, based on earlier conversations, completely are on the same page there. But I'm not sure if everybody in the room necessarily gets the connection between cyborg rights and a woman's right to choose over her own health issues. So can you kind of spell that out a little bit more?
I think it comes back to that discussion of agency. It's using technology to make myself into the person I want to be and wanting to be proud of that. One of the reasons I love the word pride there is because in much of the world and through much of time, a woman who wants control over sex is a slut, or a harlot, or something else that's horrible. I don't want to be horrible. I want that power and I want that agency, and I'm going to get that through chemical, mechanical, technological means. I've had several different forms of birth control inserted into me, and I can't think of what would be more cyborgian than that.
It's an implant in
Yeah.
essence, right? Okay, so a cyborg then, at least philosophically, is a human being, well, we can have animal cyborgs, but we'll say a human being who is deciding to take control of their body and control their processes or their fertility processes, their birth, we'll just leave it at fertility processes, and using any technologies necessary to control the processes.
I think one of the interesting things you've put in there that I want to like push back and complicate for a second is who decides. Because we also are often subject to policies that you could say make people into cyborgs.
Perfect.
Which they may or may not be willing to do.
No, you're right. I agree. I stipulate that point, counselor. Okay, so Neil, why don't you chime in a little bit on cyborg pride? Are you proud to be a cyborg? Are you a cyborg?
Yes, I feel cyborg, but I guess it's more of a, as we've mentioned, the control of the body through technology, but in my case it's more the control of the mind, so it's more how we can use technology to extend our perception of reality or to modify our mind, or how technology can modify our brains in a way. And in a way, that's the way I feel cyborg. It's more of a psychological thing, or I mean, physically or biologically, there is cybernetics in my body, but actually what really affected me was the union between the software and the brain that created this new sense or perception extension. So I guess we'll see that there's different types of people identifying as cyborg for different reasons. One might be more of a for biological reasons, others might be more psychological, and others might be more neurological even.
Yeah, that was actually part of your talk, those 3 reasons, right?
Yes, I think
Right.
that
Yeah.
mostly there's 3 different types, I think.
Now, do you think it's possible that someone, for example, could become a cyborg for psychological reasons, like you said, but at the same time reject the notion of a cyborg identity?
Yes.
Okay, so talk about that a little bit, because I asked you if you are proud to be a cyborg. Does that mean that you are unified neurologically, physically, and psychologically, and also accept the cyborg identity?
Yes, so there's, in my case, yes, but I've met many people that are biological cyborgs but do not identify themselves as cyborgs, or people that have no cybernetics, no intervention of cybernetics in their body, but they identify themselves as cyborgs. So there's different situations, I guess. We find more and more emails from children emailing us saying that they identify themselves as cyborgs and that their body does not correspond to that. That's why they want implants to extend their perception, or they want new senses in their body because they feel that they are cyborgs, yet that's why they need surgery to have these new...
So let's talk about that. So apparently children will find Neil's work online and then write to him, and they're expressing their, I guess, their sadness that they are not cyborgs. Is that right?
Yeah, maybe not particularly they see my work, but I guess they've grown up surrounded by technology. They feel that technology is such a part of their lives and their mind that they feel that they should be technology, not use it or wear it, but actually be technology, and they feel that their body does not have the technology that it should have. So that's the kind of feeling that there's more and more amount of teenagers and children emailing us about this subject, that they feel cyborg, and that's why they want to have cybernetics or electronics in their body.
So why don't you follow up? Because that's pretty fascinating. Children.
It is.
Yeah.
One of the things I've discovered in the course of interviewing many people is that there is a kind of fetish for breaking the skin. I think there's a really good argument to be made that anyone with a cell phone and the capacity to use it has really crossed the line between being just a human and a machine to being a human-machine system. That fetish for breaking the skin, I think, is a lot about separation from other people, like trying to cross a line for identity, and you see that in a lot of identity markers. And it's also, I think, a way people want to convey commitment. I think, I'm not saying a fetish to break the skin is good or bad, but that a lot of it is about saying, I just want to show the world that I'm willing to go far, I'm willing to commit, and breaking the skin is a way of committing. Going back to the kind of smartphone example, we do see these changes of habit become changes of mind, become psychological cyborganism, as well as physical, on all sorts of levels, positive and negative. Of course, this is like all of Cransford's technology. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. I think that point about really wanting to kind of become more of a cyborg, and going back to the point of pride, is that feeling of not having rights, not being well represented. I mean, I've done a lot of work in the queer community, and one of the reasons we focus on pride in the queer community is because we're trying to counter a really negative story that's told about us. I mean, if you're normal in a way, you don't need pride. I mean, that's, I'm stretching the word
Sure.
there. But pride is a way of pushing back on the negatives. And that kind of gets into some really interesting questions about where we're getting the idea of authentic humans, which I think we end up tangling up with really fast here, and possibly those kids are tangling up with too.
So what can cyborgs learn from the queer community?
Oh, I think a lot.
Yeah? Yeah, what are some of those things?
A lot more, I think, about, I think the queer community's done a really good job of learning about self-care and prioritizing self-care in a way that I haven't seen as much in the body hacker community. And really, like, there is a dynamic in the queer community of go to the extremes and prove that you belong. And it can get really toxic, but the recognition of that over the years has created kind of support systems where people are like, you're queer, you don't have to prove it. Just be yourself. You don't have to do self-harm activities to be queer enough. And I do think that there's a lot more egging on in the cyborg identified communities and less self-care. And they could learn that, I think, from the queer movements.
Right. Neil, have you ever been to a gay pride parade? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah. So do you think that cyborgs will someday have a cyborg pride parade?
Yes. I mean, if you organize it, I mean.
Who would go to a cyborg pride parade?
Look,
All right.
wow, we were worried about.
Awesome. Okay, we'll meet you here in a year. All right.
But yeah, I think there's many parallelisms also with the bioethics committees that we face now with cyborg surgeries. That the reasons why bioethical committees say no are, there is a parallelism with transgender surgeries in the 50s and 60s, why they would say no as well. They say that it's not necessary. For example, in my case, they said it was not necessary to perceive ultraviolet and infrared. In some cases, they would say it was not necessary to change gender. Also, it says, they said they were worried about the possible dangers of having this inside the head, or doing the surgery was a bit, they were worried about the unknown, and also they were worried about the image the hospital would have if someone would come out with an antenna sticking out of the head, in the same way that back then they would think that, what would people think if a man came in and came out as a woman, or the other way around, and about the image of the hospital as well. So I feel a close parallelisms with the bioethical committees.
Yeah, I do think, though, the other side of that is that there's a lot less emphasis appropriately on gender reassignment surgery and trans identity. And that's really positive, because there's a lot of people who really don't want to. It's a very physically traumatic process, and there's a lot of people who don't want to go through that, and that doesn't make them not trans. That makes them people who don't want to go through an invasive surgery.
Yes, I think that's an important point. And I don't know if we've really established the point here, so I'll say it. It's my belief, and I believe I share this with y'all, is that transgendered people today embody personally so many of the technologies that we have to bear to make someone a cyborg. Prosthetics, implants, transplants, cosmetic surgery, a whole host of pharmaceutical support, all of these things to have the agency to change their body to better integrate with the identity they have. It's basically a full body prosthetic, augmentation enhancement. So that's a transgendered person.
And constructed socially, and also to give props to the tattoo community, which has blazed a lot of ground there, and also blazed a lot of ground around pride and legal issues. Dr. Yin Thompson's talk was fantastic for looking at the difficulties of working while a modified person, and that really does extend to cyborgs and cyborg-identified people.
That's right. So that, it's interesting because you made 2 points that are almost at odds with each other. But I love that because it just shows the nuances of the conversation. Earlier, you were talking about almost like communities of breaking the flesh, right? And then we're talking about how transgendered people today are not being pressured to break the flesh, that you can be trans without surgery, and that's okay too. And I think that's important to realize that you don't need to necessarily break the flesh to be a cyborg either, right? So, like I came out when I was 30. I'm gay, and I'm wondering, like, is there a coming out process for cyborgs? There has to be, right? Like we talked just a few minutes ago about some people who don't identify as cyborgs, although we may recognize them as such. It's not for us to say you're a cyborg whether you like it or not. Do you think there is a parallel with sort of coming out that eventually they will recognize this, or is it different?
Well, I think this is a really difficult question.
Yeah.
Because it kind of depends on how you define cyborg. I mean, if we start looking at almost like a Kinsey-style scale, or the like really complicated multi-dimensional scale that's being used.
Ours would have to be hexadecimal. From 0 to 15.
And with some imaginary numbers. If I say having birth control is a cyborgian mod, then I am saying billions of people who would not necessarily accept the identity are cyborgs. I am, to some degree, thrusting that identity on them. Again, I think we can lift a little bit from queer culture by saying you don't have to be, you don't have to self-identify as gay. If you've occasionally been attracted to same-sex people, you can just be, you with that thing that is there. Depending on, a lot of this just goes back to identity formation. So can people be modified and not be cyborgs? Well, we are modified. We live in, we live in 2016, and we are really, all of us, 7.5 billion, it's right there in the number, way far from, the natural position.
Right.
There's no way you should have this many people on our little blue planet, which kind of means we're all cyborgs.
That's right. Okay, so there are people who identify as cyborgs, there are people who may come out as cyborgs, and there are people who just flat out reject the identity because it doesn't suit them, all right? But regardless of that sort of position on this new Kinsey scale, many of them may experience discrimination as cyborgs, right? And we can't underestimate that. I mean, look at how quickly Google Glass was rejected, right? I don't think it's a stretch to think that as more people are visibly cyborg, that there can be a similar backlash. Like Neil has felt some of it. People think he's recording, right? So as more people show up and people are afraid and they don't understand, they may get thrown out of bars. All the same things that you saw with Google Glass. So Neil, can you talk about some of the stories you've heard about cyborg discrimination or even violence against cyborgs through the Cyborg Foundation?
Yeah, but most of these attacks have been not because the person was united to technology, but because they thought they were filming. So it's always, I think all the attacks I've heard about are always related to privacy, and most of the cyborgs have nothing to do with, I mean, there's nothing to do with filming or recording. And in my case, the only times I've been attacked was because people thought I was also recording or filming. So it's a misunderstanding that people think that cameras only are used to film, but you can use cameras as a sensor instead. So it's, I think this is something that we can't really avoid unless you
quick
try to
follow-up on
explain.
that, Quinn.
Yeah.
So just like effeminate gay men may be more of a target because of the way they appear to the public, cyborgs who make the appearance of recording may be more of a target.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I do think there's a little bit on us in this community there, because we don't want, nobody wants to have their agency taken away, and the thought of being recorded by somebody that's part of their identity marker, it has to end at you. Like, if your modification is somehow impacting someone else's life, they have a right to have a say in that. And yeah, I can see why walking into a bar with a recording device in people's faces, that's not a place where they're feeling comfortable with that. It is an interesting thing. How do you, if it's not a recording device, how do you signal that? And I think this is a communication problem at that point. And it's a serious problem, especially when you're looking at lots of different augmentation coming in. And the other serious problem I want to just step right up to there is the things that don't look like recording, but are. I mean, right in the middle of a societal debate over surveillance. And I think it's appropriate to ask, what are my rights to not be recorded, and how are those going to be respected? Because right now, the most normal-looking dude can be covered in hidden cameras, walk up, follow me around, put all the stalking material they want to out to millions of people on the internet.
That would be called human acting. They're concealing their cyborgism.
Right. And maybe that's not entirely
Is
okay.
that a stretch?
I mean, that's interesting that you put it that way, because
Right.
you're walling off human from cyborg there, and I'm not sure that's a duality.
It's not a duality,
willing
but I was
to-
trying to go like they're doing similar to, like, they are recording in that way, but because they're trying to hide the recording, then people don't really know that they're cyborgs who are recording. So it's an assimilating or mainstreaming, and that's what I meant by.
I actually don't feel human. I don't like being defined as a human, because it kind of separates me from animals, and if I define myself as animal, it kind of separates me from organisms. So I feel much more comfortable defining myself as an organism, and in my case, I'm a cybernetic organism. So cyborg for me feels that I'm in a wider group, where I'm in the same level as a plant or as an insect, because we're all organisms. So I do feel more comfortable not being defined as a human. But I feel cyborg is actually in the same level as an insect, in a way.
It's funny, like, I feel exactly the opposite, but in a kind of like unsettled language way. Like, for me, saying human, I think of a human as an animal, and that kind of makes me feel more bound to the natural cycles than if I were to say I'm,
Organism.
well, so animal and organism versus a technological process or an algorithm, something that's discrete. What the difference for me is that technological processes are often incredibly discrete and incredibly deterministic, and I live in a non-deterministic natural world. So for me, the language that brings me back to organism is human, because it describes the non-deterministic world that I feel part of.
Did you understand that?
No,
No.
but,
No.
I feel organism is an organism. Just
Deterministic.
Well, essentially with an algorithm, you put in the same input, you'll always get the same output. And our technology is algorithmic. With nature, you put in the same input, woohoo! Who knows what's going to come out? And that's what I feel more part of.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about cyborg rights. Okay, what are cyborg rights? What are the rights that you've kind of mapped out?
It's just basically having the same rights as anyone else, so not having discrimination. Also, I think the right that we really focusing on is the right to have surgery, because there's lots of bioethical committees not accepting the fact that people want to extend their perception of reality. So extending our senses is something not ethical for many bioethical committees, and this needs to be addressed, I think. So that's one of the rights we think we should have. Also having cyborg clinics, so clinics that specialize in cyborg surgeries, because now at the moment software developers are somewhere, doctors are somewhere else, psychologists, but if we are united in one space and we have the right to have this cyborg surgery space, then we would be able to work better. And in a way, this is still not happening.
Okay, and you said you view this augmentation as part of your body, that it's an organ, right?
Yes.
And I think I've heard you say in other venues that because it's an organ, you feel that we should start to rethink of the way of the costs associated. Like, we're not currently allowed to buy organs. We pay for the procedure, but the organ itself is free. And so can you talk a little bit more about, like, that augmentation should be free, like an organ?
Yes, I think you shouldn't look at this as a device or a gadget or an electronic element. It's an organ that is should be treated like any other organ. So the ones that we develop, we actually encourage people to develop their own organs. So we explain how you can make the organ, and then what you need, the only cost really is having it surgically implanted in this case, which is, well, in my case, it was the surgeon didn't actually want to get paid for the surgery, but I had to pay for the whole renting the room and hiding it from being known, basically. And
right. I think that kind of thinking is very important in establishing the framework so that someday if someone pulls on that and yanks it, that becomes, we consider that as assault against your body and not property damage.
Yeah, that was, I filed, I was attacked by, in 2011, it was filed as a physical aggression. They broke the tip of my antenna, so this is breaking a part of my body. It's not something external. Yes.
Right.
I actually really want to reinforce what you said. You know, when I got a magnet implanted, the only way we could do it is without anesthetic. So I put my finger in some ice water for a while, and then it was cut open without any anesthesia. The first incision was too narrow, so it had to be expanded, and then it had to be sutured up at the end. And the only thing I was allowed to do there was sit still, grin, and bear it. And when I had the magnet taken out by a doctor as, you know, a healing surgery, I had all they even were like gonna hang up a curtain between me and my finger so I didn't even have to look at it. And it's a really hypocritical process at that point. You know, you can't, with these modifications that are non-medical, have anesthetic.
Right. Well, that brings up a whole new topic, which is sort of the dark world of cyborg surgery and cyborg medicine, right? And so, Neil, it really surprised me when I first heard about what you needed to go through in collaboration with a doctor to have this done, and that there was some risk to the doctor. Could you tell them a little bit about that story?
About the
doctor, like, what were his conditions for doing this procedure?
Well, first I presented the surgery to a bioethical committee, and they said no after some months. And then from that meeting, someone introduced me to a doctor that said he was willing to do the surgery as long as it all remained anonymous. So, and he was willing to do it for free. So I would only have to pay for the material and renting a space, and then...
Not his normal space.
No, it was... so we rented a room in a clinic, but the clinic didn't know what was happening in that room.
It's done in secrecy.
Yes, we didn't even have a chair to do it.
What was that?
What does this remind you of?
Well, it reminds me of early trans surgery and early women's health.
Abortions, early abortions is what it reminded me of.
Yeah, and early trans surgery as well.
Right.
Gender reassignment surgery
Exactly.
used to be very dark, and still is in much of the world.
That's right. So the overlaps with women's health issues, like you mentioned, and transgender with cyborg continue to come back.
Yeah, and not just abortions, but also access to birth control, which was illegal even in this country into the not too distant past. And there was some really dodgy things that happened around that, and people got very hurt.
Right. So just then as in now, we need to find friends in the medical community who are willing to help us, but on their terms that protect them within their professional circles.
And we need to educate the medical community about the ways in which this is normal and beneficial. And that's also a process, again, you can pull from the queer community and the trans community, where they're doing this education of medical professionals to say, this is okay for us, and you need to catch up with us. And one of the things I think we desperately need around modifications, you're starting to see it with tattooing a little bit, is some long-term academic studies of outcomes. Because it wasn't until there was more studies of, say, trans surgery outcomes when people were like, oh, this is actually a good idea. It's really helping these people. And they're self-reporting in really, really broad numbers that this saved their lives. And I don't think all cyborgian modifications go to that level. I'm sure some do and some do not. But it shouldn't have to be about life or death for you to get something that's going to make your life better. It's not the question if you want an iPhone 6. It shouldn't be the question if you want a new sense.
So I'm a big believer in full participation, right? So there's about 15 minutes left, actually. And I'd love to be able to incorporate more of you all in the conversation if you have some thoughts. And Quinn can be Phil Donahue here with a microphone. Oh, perfect. Yeah, let's hear what you have to say.
So what you said about birth control triggered something in me because recently I got my fallopian tubes removed as a means of birth control sterilization. And so I had never, until that moment, thought of that as a cyborgian act, like just removing something. I always thought about it as something that, you know, you're adding something. But really it's just about augmentation. And that triggered another thought. Of course, as become an adult and gotten more body modifications, I've always thought about, like, what's the thing that's gonna really freak me out about body modifications when I'm like old? Like, what's the thing I'm like, why would you do that to yourself? And at one point I thought, yeah, when people just start chopping off limbs just cause, maybe that'll be the thing where I like draw the line. But now, like, I have a friend, Charlie, who wants to chop his bum foot off because, you know, he'd rather get an implant. And so it's not really a question, it's just more of a topic of like the idea of removing things as a cyborgian augmentation act rather than, you know, an addition. So anybody have anything to say about that?
I do have one thing I really want to say about that, and it's a little bit about how our perceptions of our bodies follows our technology, which is my grandfather had something removed. He had his appendix removed when he was 11, and there was no antibiotic available, so they kept the wound open for 6 weeks, continuously flushing it with saline. And the doctor said, I've performed this surgery successfully over 20 times, but none of my patients have lived when he was coming in with it. And if you just think about that for a moment. This little 11-year-old kid. And of course the reason was because when you're doing an abdominal cut like that prior to antibiotics, even if you completely were successful removing all the antibiotics, pretty soon they get a massive infection throughout their body and be just as likely as not to die of septicemia in a few weeks. So to some degree, our perception of our rights around this is predicated on a world of antibiotics. And our perception of what's a good idea is to some degree always predicated on the technologies that are available to me. I think absolutely having something removed is kind of a cyborgian thing. I think it can get really complicated when it kind of overlaps with mental illness issues. There are people who kind of, you have to look at the motivations for modifications to some degree in the medical community, but I actually think that's just as true of plastic surgery, where there is no psych review. And I think that's a terrible mistake people are making. And that's plastic surgery, just as dangerous as any of the stuff we want to do when it comes to medical complications and infection. So there is a double standard there, and I think that's something that we can kind of latch onto to educate.
That's good.
So you discussed that when you had your surgery done, that you had to do it in secret. Since then, have you run into more and more doctors that say that they would have facilitated it actually in the public eye and not remain anonymous and such like that? Has it been more acceptable since now that it's been done, that you've run into more and more medical, practitioners that will actually accept them when you do that? Or do
No, we've received many emails from doctors willing to do surgeries, but not publicly, no.
Not publicly at all?
No.
No, but because it's on the fringe side of things, and they're, scared to have if there's anything goes wrong. Is that what you're
Yes.
saying?
So,
But you haven't had any practitioners come out and say openly that they would just do this in the open eye and.
well, we're talking with Japanese, the Bioethical Committee from Japan, and they're open-minded with actually accepting many surgeries, but it's still in talks.
So it's more of not just their image, but the community around them that might shun them
Yes,
completely
yes.
out of the field completely, or lose
mean,
their license
'cause
completely because of
Yes,
something.
because bioethical committees is very complex. If there's 14 doctors, 13 say yes.